Hey everyone, I'm Trent Kusters, co-founder and director at League of Geeks, and this is the Game Maker's Notebook. Thanks for joining us again today. Yesterday, I had a wonderful conversation. It was an absolute honor to talk to legendary game narrative designer and writer Josh Sawyer of Obsidian Entertainment. He has most recently been the game director on his little pet project over there, Pentiment, which went on to get a 10 out of 10 from IGN. It's getting rave reviews around the place. It's a phenomenal game. I'm sort of halfway through it at the moment. I do suggest you check it out. Don't miss it. But anyway, we start the podcast off by talking about the strange and uncanny coincidences, and there's a lot of them, that led to him getting his start as a web designer back at Black Isle Studios in the 2000s, early 2000s, I think it was. And then we work through his career and his work on legendary titles such as Icewind Dale 1 and 2, Neverwinter Nights 2, Fallout New Vegas, Pillars of Eternity, the list goes on. We also speak about how Josh went about successfully pitching a title as quirky as Pentiment, his historical narrative murder mystery title set in 16th century Bavaria, to Obsidian and Xbox Game Studios. And then we speak about that game and the immense amount of detail and love and care that small team of 13, I believe it was, over at Obsidian poured into that title. Just fair warning, we speak about fonts and font tech in quite a lot of detail. So something for the tech artists out there. And then lastly, Josh gives us some sage advice on how to look after ourselves and others whilst doing this crazy thing that we do. For any cycling aficionados also, these first 3 minutes are for you. I hope you enjoy the chat. I had a wonderful time catching up with Josh and chatting with him. Enjoy. G'day, Josh. Welcome to the Game Maker's Notebook.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Of course. Now, I sent a little Slack post to my team, and I said, "Hey, I'm interviewing Josh Sawyer tomorrow. I'm over at Obsidian," and I grabbed your Wikipedia page or whatever, and just said, "This is him. If you have any questions, let me know. I'll see if I can sort of work him in," which is my cheeky way of getting really insightful questions from my team. And it was you. The photo with your Wikipedia is you working on a bike.
Yep.
You got a tire like right in front of the screen. So the first question is like that by you now look, you've got cyclist written across your chest. Avid cyclist, I see.
Yeah. It's been hard in the last couple of years because a lot of reasons, but one of the big ones is it's been hard to get bike parts.
Right. Of course, they do the shipping like woes of COVID as well.
Yeah, it's crazy because when so many things were limited and outdoor stuff was generally like safer, at least early on, it was recognized like it's probably safer to be outside if you're going to go do stuff. And so like you can't go to gyms and can't do all the stuff. So cycling became really a focus for a lot of people, and e-bikes. And the thing is, both traditional bicycles and e-bikes, there was a huge boom. Like, I think we haven't seen a boom like this since the 70s. And all the shops were completely slammed. All of the sort of pipelines for manufacturing and shipping stuff were really disrupted. They were overloaded and disrupted. So For example, I still feel bad saying this because I still haven't built it, but just before COVID, my friend and my co-writer on the project, Kate Dollarhide, who is also a cyclist, I helped her source all the parts. I'm sorry, 98% of the parts to build a bike,
Yeah.
but I didn't have spokes.
Oh no, you just couldn't get spokes.
I literally couldn't get them. So I had hubs, and I had rims, and I had tires, and I had rim tape, and I couldn't get spokes and nipples to actually, because I build all the wheels for my bikes, and shops couldn't do it because they were so super slammed. It was like a wheel build for them was always like 5 or 6 weeks out.
Oh, wow.
Which is crazy. And so we just never got around to building the bike. So
is that the bike behind you? Just
No, that's a different, but that bike I also bought, I bought that frame set just before COVID. And that is like, it's a mini velo. So it uses like BMX size, rims and tires.
Oh, wow.
So it's kind of like a travel bike. And that's what I'm going to use it for when I build it. But it was just like, I couldn't even repair my bikes. And I had I had some spoke breakages. I had, I think, a rear derailleur break. I had some problems with cranksets. And like I said, I can do all the work on my own in my garage, but I couldn't get parts. And so I started weightlifting.
But now, during that COVID crisis, right? To keep the body moving.
But I had injuries. Like I broke my wrist. I injured this wrist with a lunate bone bruise. I crashed my bike and I couldn't ride. Like I had horrible road rash. I had COVID. I just got over some other stuff. It's been rough, but I'm trying to get back into it.
Well, I do want to come back to the outdoor stuff because I know you're an avid outdoorsman at some point, and you've been, and this is my segue into, usually how we open the show, which is, may surprise you, is not cyclist chat, bike chat, but it's talking about games and how we got into games, our first experience with games. And you're someone who's been in the industry, like you've got some classic titles under your belt, like I think 2000 is the first credit I've got here, over 20 years. And the industry it can be a tricky thing, and making games, you're indoors a lot of the time and balancing that out. So I'd love to chat about that a little bit later on. But for now, let's dive right back to the start. So little baby Josh, when was the first time that games became a part of your life, when they kicked the door down and made their way in?
I think that the first, like little experiences I had, I'll say this with some clarification. My family wasn't impoverished, but we were kind of poor.
Yeah.
And so we couldn't afford like really fancy stuff. So I remember we had I should have looked it up because I remember answering this question recently. Radio Shack, which was a chain of electronic stores in the US that I think is gone now, or if it's not gone, they're like almost can't find them. But they had a version of Pong. Essentially, it wasn't Pong. It was like Great Value Pong.
Yes.
And it had the main paddle and then the little paddle, and you would run it to your UHF in the back and turn it to channel 3 and run it there. And my brother and I would play that, and that was like the first video game experience that I had, and that was fun. And then my brother, for Christmas one year, my grandmother bought him an Atari 2600, and so we played a lot of the classics. We had Pitfall and Adventure. I think Adventure was like the first one that I really got into, and that's the one where you're just a little square running around a maze, and there are the duck dragons attacking you, and you can get an arrow and stab them, and you're trying to get a chalice. And I had a lot of fun with that, but I don't really think they had taken hold of me. Like I was like, okay, games, these are fun, these are cool. And then I remember in the mid 80s, I was at the public library because, again, I couldn't afford a home computer, or my family couldn't afford a home computer, but I lived very close to a public library in my hometown that had a really nice library, and it had Apple IIe's and it had Commodore 64s. And I had played a bunch of games on the 2Es because those were also at my grade school. And so I had played Oregon Trail and Dark Tower and a bunch of other games. But then I saw on the Commodore 64, I saw an older boy playing Bard's Tale, the first Bard's Tale. and I was really blown away because it's color.
Yeah.
The sound in the Commodore 64 was way better than anything I had seen on an Apple II or a PC.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, what is this? And so I started talking to that older boy, and we became friends. He introduced me to Dungeons and Dragons, Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. And then I really got into computer role-playing games and tabletop role-playing games. And yeah, I've just been playing them since then.
I love it. It's a classic story of D&D panic as well, like older boy at the arcade, like influencing you, like introducing you to D&D.
Yep, exactly. And it's funny because it wasn't my first introduction to D&D. I had a friend who had a PC, and he would play Wizardry and a few other games, and we would just play together. Like, that was a very common thing when I was growing up, is friends, even after I got a computer, like, we would go over to each other's houses, and it was cool to like sit around the PC and kind of play and talk to each other while we were playing. And my friend Ryan, who had would play Ultima, and he would play Wizardry, he had basic and expert Dungeons and Dragons, which are the kind of like precursors to AD&D. And I didn't know that AD&D existed. And so it was the older boy. It was like he, like opened my third eye, and I was like, advanced Dungeons and Dragons. And it was kind of funny because I did play a lot of basic and expert D&D, but then now AD&D, and that was like really when I started going off the rails.
Hell yeah. It's amazing how many people just found their bridge into games, and especially game design. Like, how long did it take you to pick up the DM mantle?
Oh, it's interesting because I feel like when we were kids, especially playing basic and expert, we were just constantly trading off. Like,
oh, interesting. You didn't have like one of the friends wasn't like the DM. You were just sort of taking it in turns?
Yeah, we were kind of just handing it around. And then cool. in high school when we were playing, or middle school and high school when we were playing AD&D, we had different campaigns, but we were all kind of rotating. So they were different characters and different campaigns. But like, my friend Chris Hake would run some games in Dragonlance. He really liked Dragonlance. I would run some in my homebrew setting because I was doing that shit even back then. My friend Jody would run like really cool games. My friend Brian would run his own games and make his own systems.
Yeah.
And it was very common for us to play in each other's stuff and DM each other's stuff. And I love DMing, but I didn't want to stop playing. So I was glad that I had friends that would run. Sometimes they were solo or small campaigns, or sometimes big group ones. But there wasn't like one player that, I guess I was kind of the de facto DM, but so many other people were running games that I never really thought of myself as like, I'm the DM of our friend group.
Yeah. So it's the interesting thing about D&D, and your, like, as I said, it's a common story, like game writers, game designers, game developers start with D&D. That sort of gets them into the homebrew game creation, so to speak. But your path led you directly to D&D in video games as well. So what happened between there and there? What was your path to games? How did it come about for you? Because I know everyone's entry around that point of time into games, there wasn't just a clear path, like go to college, then get your game design degree and then walk in. How did you happen to find yourself over at Black Isle?
Oh man, it's so weird. I mean, I have to say, through all of this, like, it really was luck. Like,
so much of it is, right, when you look back on these things.
Oh my God, I could have at each step that I'm going to describe, something could have gone slightly differently, and I never would have happened. Yeah. So it's interesting. It's very weird because it's such a strange course. Like, my father is a bronze sculptor, and I wanted to be an illustrator for most of my young life and going into high school. I really wanted to be a fantasy illustrator. I loved the TSR artists, especially because I was so exposed to their work all the time in the books. Yep. But like Larry Elmore, Jeff Easley, Brom, Rob Ruppel, Clyde Caldwell, like Keith Parkinson, I just was like, these are incredible. And I was like, I want to do what they do. And my father's an artist, so he was very encouraging and helpful to me. And then around high school, I started drifting out of it because I'm colorblind. And when I started to need to paint, It was very frustrating for me to paint skin tones. Very, very difficult. And
did you discover that during that process, or did you know that you were colorblind going into it?
I knew I was colorblind, but I was able to work around it usually.
Until you hit that point, right?
Until I hit the point where now it's painting time and you have to start to learn how to paint with acrylics, paint with oils. And because I wanted to illustrate, and the thing is, like, D&D art is about characters. Like so many of these things, like covers to the, Dark Elf trilogy, like, I wanted to do that. I wanted to portray my characters, like characters and stories, and skin tone and hair color and like mixing. And it was very, very hard for me. And I got really discouraged and I started kind of drifting out into other things. But because my dad knew how passionate I was about this, he had taken some jobs. This is going to sound like really crazy, but so my dad started doing restoration work for the city of Lake Geneva, which is where TSR is, where I grew up in Wisconsin. So like 30 minutes from Lake Geneva, maybe. So I guess Lake Geneva is full of vandals who kept like defacing a bunch of their statues. And my dad was restoring them. And at one point he wound up working on a sculpture project with Jeff Easley from TSR. And I was like, no, like, no way.
How old were you at this point, Josh?
I was, I think maybe when he first started doing it, I was 16 or 17. And I was losing it. But like by this point, I was kind of getting out of art, but I was still just held these guys in awe.
Yeah, they're heroes.
And so I got to go to TSR. I got to walk into the studio where the artists worked. And I was shocked because one, they all worked in one room, which I thought was unreal. There's a lot of stuff about that was not good from my perspective. Like they really weren't paid that well. They were all staff artists. They didn't have the rights to any of their work.
Yeah.
And I remember, it's funny because my dad is a very blunt man and he'll just ask things like I remember looking on the wall of Jeff Easley's workspace, and there was the original oil painting for one of the books of the Dark Elf trilogy, like Exile. And I'm like, what the fuck, man? Like, that's it. Like, that's the painting. Yeah. Like, I read this book over and over and like, that's it. And my dad just says, how much you get paid for that?
And you're like, Dad.
Like, even then I was like, I don't think you're supposed to ask that. And he said, I can't remember what he said, but I remember both me and my dad, because my dad was very open about like all the, because he's constantly negotiating stuff he's a freelance sculptor.
Yeah.
And I was like, and my dad was like, well, how long did it take you to make? And he was like, this long. And my dad was like, that doesn't sound like a good deal. but my dad said like, but you have reproduction rights of it, don't you? And he was like, no. And so I was like, wow, this kind of seems like it sucks. I think since TSR is kind of gone now, I can say this stuff. But anyway, like that experience was really crazy. But I got to meet like a lot of those artists, and I was just over the moon. And then I was at Winter Fantasy. God, so I must have been maybe 16, because I went to Winter Fantasy, which was the winter version of Gen Con that was in Milwaukee. Because Gen Con was getting really big.
Yeah.
And my dad called me and he said, hey, Rob Ruppel, artist, who has now done tons of stuff in video games.
Yeah.
Said Rob was wondering if you could be a model for one of his paintings. And I'm like, so I went to TSR. And he worked extensively from models, and his wife at the time was an incredible sculptor. So she would actually sculpt little maquettes of incredible detail, and he would photograph them and then paint them.
Oh, wow.
They were so detailed. It was incredible. And so I posed, and I remember, and maybe I'm going to get some more people in trouble. We went, and Clyde Caldwell actually had some of the swords from his artwork made into real swords.
Oh, wow.
And as a prop, Rob took one of his swords without asking and said, like, here, like, pose with this. And he said, if you ever see Clyde again, do not tell him that I and so I posed first, folks. Yeah, I posed with it. So all this story, by the way, is going to come back later. So like I posed with it, And he took the photos, and then later he showed me like it was being used on a module, a Dragonlance module called Night Sword.
Awesome.
And I was like, oh my God, this is so cool. And I'm not that big on it because it's a dragon that was like his wife's sculpture photographed and breathing fire. And it's about squires who are going to become knights of Solamnia.
All right, cool.
And I was like,
and
yeah,
you were
that's
his
so
squire model?
Yeah. It was
cool.
like, I was like, oh, this is so cool. You can barely tell it's me, but if you squint, you're like, okay, that's Josh. That's Josh like 30 years ago. But then, so time passed and like, whatever, that's one event that I'll come back to. But I went to college, and I actually went to college for music. I grew up singing with my dad. I started doing more and more music stuff in high school. Then I went to the Lawrence Conservatory of Music in Appleton, Wisconsin.
So was it a musical family? You say singing with your dad. Your dad was an artist as well.
Yeah, and my dad played. My dad and his he had a couple of bands that he was in. He had a friend who was ran a bicycle shop, which is how I got into some of the cycling. Tom Klein, and they were Sawyer and Klein, and they were an acoustic music duo that would play around just like local. Yeah. And they would play at like local bars and stuff like that, and a lot of singer-songwriter stuff. And my dad has a beautiful voice and plays guitar wonderfully. And I never learned to play instruments, but I did learn to sing with him. Yeah. And then like I got into high school, and I had not done any sort of formal school stuff with music. And I started doing really well in musicals and choir, and won some awards for that. And then I was like, oh, maybe I should go to school for music. So I went to Lawrence University, the Conservatory of Music, for voice. But because I didn't really have a strong foundation in theory, and I didn't have very good keyboard skills, it was very hard, and I was very lazy. And I will say there were other students who had a similar level of lack of knowledge of theory and keyboard, and they just worked really hard and they got through it. I didn't. I wasn't ready for that level of commitment. I loved singing, and I loved my voice lessons, and theory was rough and keyboarding was rough, and it's a really heavy course load, and they expect a lot out of their music majors, especially the performance majors. So I was like, I don't think I can do this, and I switched over to the college, and I had always liked history, kind of abstractly. And I got into like historical fantasy through Darklands, a 1992 game that was sort of the long-term inspiration for Pentiment.
Interesting.
And I also done a lot of theater. I should have said I was initially a music and theater double major. Yeah. Okay. And I had done, we have a thing in the Midwest called forensics, which is kind of like dramatic interpretation, performance. It's public speaking. It's kind of a lot of stuff combined, but it can be acting, it can be recitation. It's not musical. But I did a bunch of what's called dramatic interpretation, which was a lot of soliloquies from Shakespeare's histories. And that kind of got me interested in the relationship between history and theater, and looking at how Shakespeare used historical texts like Holinshead, which are very biased, as the foundation for the Henriad, the Henry IV plays, Henry V, Henry VI, and a number of other works. So I had this kind of continuity of like music and theater and then history, which was kind of backing a lot of this stuff. So I got into history, and I didn't really know what I was going to do with it, but I knew that I really liked it a lot, and I wanted to study more of it. And I was never a good student in college, but I did really genuinely love the subject matter, and I loved a lot of my professors. And it's funny, I remember a friend of mine said, like, God, what did he say? It's something, he was talking about me, and he's like, he's not a very good student, but he is an academic. In that, like I loved this stuff. But I was like always the rotten apple.
Yeah, just don't know what to do with that love for it.
Yeah, and so during this time, because I don't know why, I just started getting into HTML because it was the mid 90s, and I taught myself HTML. And this time there weren't WYSIWYG or graphical editors for web pages. You had to code by hand. Just code them, in Notepad, basically. Like, you didn't even really have good environments to edit this stuff in. It was all markup and like, great, do it and run it or like load it. And if there are errors, you go back and fix it because there's nothing to debug or fix anything. And I continued doing Photoshop stuff because I had always been into using computers for graphic design. And I mean, I don't think I'm that good at it, but I had something of an artistic background. So I kept doing that. And then toward the end of my college days, when I almost dropped out at one point, my friend Anne convinced me not to drop out, which I will be forever grateful to her because I don't think it would have gone well. Yeah. And so I stayed in and I got my degree barely. And I did not know what I was going to do with it. Maybe in my mind, I thought I was going to do dramaturgical work, like, because I did wind up getting a theater minor. I was actually, I will say I was the first theater minor in the history of this university because they never had minors. They didn't have minors until like 2 years before I graduated. So I had started with a history major, a theater major that kind of got downgraded. And then I was like, well, I'll just do the minor and I'll be the first minor. Yay. But I was like, I don't know what I'm going to do with this. I thought maybe because I was getting into tattoos, maybe I could be an apprentice at a tattoo parlor and maybe the color limitation wouldn't be as big. I don't know. I don't know what I was thinking, honestly. But
and how old are you around this time? You're in your early 20s?
Early 20s, yeah. And
so it all checks out, having no idea what to do with your life. Completely checks out. Yeah.
I had taught myself Flash animation. So this is Flash 3 around, like the late 90s. And I was about to graduate and I thought I was going to go work for a local ISP doing web development. And maybe I was going to get an apprenticeship with a tattoo parlor I had done a website for in exchange for tattoos. And so I really did not know what I was going to do. And then my friend Michael, by coincidence, again, each step here is like luck after luck. My friend Michael said, "Hey, Josh, there's Interplay is hiring for a webmaster position for some new RPG they're working on. Maybe you should apply." Because I had done by this point, I'd actually done a fair amount of professional web development, just freelance.
And were you playing like Fallout and things like this at the time?
Yeah, I should say, like, through all of this,
I'm playing mainlining video games as well.
I mean, there's like the reason I had a 2.4 grade point average when I graduated is because I was playing video games all the time. There was a point where I was in 4 tabletop role-playing games per week.
Yeah.
Like I was running 2 of them and then I was playing in 2 of them and I was playing video game. Like I was just, and doing other stuff. So, not going to class necessarily. So, like I didn't know what I was going to do. I squandered a lot of my time, which again, this is why when people ask like how I got into the industry, I'm like, don't,
there's not a blueprint here.
This is not a template for anything. But
the webmaster role.
Yeah, the webmaster role. So I applied and I got another thing I would not say to do. I wrote a 4-page cover letter.
Good.
Where I was like, keep in mind, this is for a web development position. And I was like, here's where I think role-playing games are going to go in the future. Who the fuck are you?
Yeah, that's it. It's like, this kid's definitely going to stay in his lane if we hire him, for sure.
Again, just like completely ridiculous. And then there were 62 applicants. I remember this very clearly. There were 62 applicants.
Yeah.
3 of us knew Flash.
Wow.
And they really wanted, because it was so new, and they really wanted people that knew Flash. Also, I had not well done, but like for the time, I had actual professional websites I had done for clients using Flash animation.
For tattoos.
For tattoos. Well, and for other, like an ISP and some other stuff. So they were like, oh, this guy actually knows how to use it and do scripting and other stuff.
He's not just doodling around in it.
Yeah, he's not just doodling around. So the first choice was not me. But that guy declined the job because he wanted to go move to Seattle to be with his girlfriend.
Thank you, random applicant.
Thank you, guy. So I was the second choice, and they offered me the job. And it was about the 25th anniversary of D&D, I think. It was either the 25th anniversary of D&D or AD&D or something. But they sent me a catalog. So to prep me for the position, they sent me a bunch of materials. and TSR actually sent it to me.
Oh, wow.
And I didn't know at the time before I got hired, but it was for the Planescape Torment website.
Mm-hmm.
That was like my first job. But they sent me all the stuff, and at the top was a catalog, the 25th anniversary TSR, whatever, and it's a painting of me. It's like
this painting
of
the Squire, Josh the Squire.
Yeah, from like 7 years ago or whatever that Rob Ruppel did of me. And I was like, what? So it gets crazier. So then I was like, wow, that's surreal. It wasn't important. I was just like, this is so weird.
Did you have one of those moments, when things like that happen where the coincidence is so uncanny or intense that you think it must be like, did you think that they were sending it to you on purpose or trolling you? Was there a moment of like,
I was just kind of stunned. I was like, I don't know what's going on. And it's a really cool painting. It was just on this really fairly obscure module. So then right after I graduated, 2 weeks later, I flew to California. Like, wow. Incredible. Like I graduated I was on academic probation twice. Like I just was stumbling forward through college, and then I moved to California and I started as a webmaster, and I got right into it. And I do feel like I worked really hard as a webmaster, and I developed the website for Planescape Torment, and which was fantastic. And then I became the webmaster for all of Black Isle. So I developed the websites for Baldur's Gate 2 and Icewind Dale, which I eventually wound up working on, and then also the pre BioWare acquisition of Neverwinter Nights. So the original website for them, which was crazy.
And did you enjoy this work? Like, were you just,
were you
sort of constantly, was there any sort of notion of looking over the fence at the game development side of things, or?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. You knew that you wanted to be there?
Yeah. I mean, I would say it was crazy too, because like, I didn't really have any conception of how games were made. Like I knew people made them obviously, but I didn't know what the staffs looked like or what the jobs were.
Yeah. Isn't that amazing? I was the same. Like that's when I decided that I wanted to be in games, because I watched some random video online about what a game writer was. And I was like, that's me. I'm a writer. I can do that. And before that, I'd played games my entire life, but just kind of thought they came off a magical conveyor belt or something.
Yeah, it was weird. And I even had some sense of like Michael Cranford and Brian Fargo as like individual people I was aware of through Bard's Tale and all that stuff. But like, I really still didn't have an understanding. And when I got there, I really wanted to work with the dev team as a webmaster. I did enjoy doing the web development. I don't think I was great at it or anything, but I did have the skills. I did work hard. I did care a lot about the subject matter. But as I was working with the people on the dev team, I started realizing like, I think I could do this. I was like, I think I could be a designer. I started to understand what a designer was. I'm like, I think I can do this.
Yeah. Right.
Like I don't have the technical skills to understand the tool set, but it doesn't seem like any of these other people do either. Like they're just, we're all learning these proprietary tools as we go. But I'm like, I have the D&D background. I have the Forgotten Realms background.
And how old are you around this point? Like you're early to mid 20s still, right?
Yeah,
just
20.
College.
Yeah, I guess I was 24-ish, 23, 24. And so then I had a day where something clicked, and I was telling someone about this crazy module that I was the cover on, and I pulled it out, and then I looked at it, and I realized, oh shit, the person who wrote this module works in Black Isle. It was Colin McComb, who was one of the main writers on Torment, and then went on to he's still doing crazy stuff. And I went over and I was like, Colin, do you know who this is? And he was like, no, I have no idea. And I'm like, that's me. And I told him the whole story, and he was just like, he's like, that's crazy. Wow. So yeah, it really came all the way around. And, but no, like at a certain point on Icewind Dale, I had been talking with Fergus Urquhart, who was the head of Black Isle. He's still my boss now.
One of the founders, right?
Yeah. One of the founders of Obsidian.
Yeah.
And, I just convinced him, or maybe I convinced other people in the studio. Like I knew what I was talking about. I was really enthusiastic, and he said, okay, you can do junior design work on Icewind Dale as a designer. And that was it.
Wow. There it is. That's how it all started. Amazing. And so that, do you remember the kinds of conversations that you were having with people? Or because I think back to when I did a short stint in games journalism, and I was at a conference, the national sort of games conference here in Australia. God, like almost over 15 years ago or something now. And I remember talking, just, drinking at an event, talking to some game developers from a local studio here called Taurus Games. And I happened to be talking to their lead designer and lead animator. And I went on a rant about GoldenEye and like why GoldenEye was such seminal like FPS design at its time, and even in the context of a console and, as a licensed product and blah, blah. And then I got a call the next week and they were just like, hey, we've got a design gig. But it's for a project that we need a writer for, and we don't have a writer in the building. So do you want to be a designer writer? And I can remember that exact conversation. And it's funny that you talk about the degree to which luck plays in these things, because it's just like I could have just been talking to someone else at that party, or not decided, or been like, I won't bother these guys with my random GoldenEye rant or something. It's just absolutely incredible how much, and then of course there's an amount of privilege that plays into these things in different ways and forms. It's just amazing how, especially before there was this pipeline of college that teach, especially ones like DigiPen and RMIT out here or USC, that have these incredible games programs that you can just, the amazing game designers just come out of them and you can hire them straight away. It's a legitimate path. It's amazing how different folks find themselves into games and the little zigs and zags. It seems like you were being forced by the universe into like Black Isle specifically, though, somehow.
It's very weird too, because even in college, it was strange. Like, even though I didn't really know what I was going to do with the training, the academic training I was getting, I was confident I was going to make games, except I thought I was going to make tabletop role-playing games.
Right.
And I didn't understand that's a profession. I was just doing it. Like I was making, that's where a lot of my time was going, is I was making my own game systems and then running them with my friends. And so I was like, of course I'm going to do this. I'm just going to get the money to publish this, and then I'm going to publish it. And it seemed very matter of fact to me, but like, because I didn't understand anything. And this will sound extremely arrogant, but like when I played D&D, even in middle school, AD&D, I remember, because I was playing it a lot, and I would complain about rules. My people playing with me would complain about rules, and I started just saying like, "Do you mind if I change this? What if I just change this rule?" And they're like, "Oh, okay." And so I started changing it, and then I started changing more, and I started changing more. And my thinking at the time was like, this is literally just writing stuff down and trying it and then revising it if it doesn't work. I see no reason why I can't do this.
Yeah.
And it wasn't even thinking about it, like I said, professionally. I was just like, I can make games. I am making games right now. I'm going to keep making games. So I always thought I was going to do it, but I didn't think it was going to be like this.
Yeah. Oh, how? All right. So now I want to skip ahead. I want to, because, I want to hit some of you've got a lot of games here, so I'm not going to hit all of them. But there are some main points that I want to hit, I think, externally as someone looking in at your career that, they're quite interesting points. So the first one is Icewind Dale 2. So you've spent time as a junior designer on Icewind Dale, and then just a couple of years later, you're on Icewind Dale 2 as lead designer. How was that? Like, how did that come about? And stepping onto a project as lead designer the first time, was it a similar thing? You're like, I'm just changing things. Did you have that level of confidence or arrogance, as you put it just before, for that?
Yeah, I did. I really was like, I can just do this. I think if I succeed as a director, it's because I have a clear vision that I can communicate to people.
Yeah.
And while my skills and ability to articulate that vision and refine it have improved over the years, one would hope, I think even back then, I had the ability to, I remember there was a coworker of mine, I won't name his name because this is an unflattering thing he said about me, where he kind of said behind my back, like, he doesn't know where he's going. I think he said he doesn't know where he's going. And I said, and I've heard about it, and I corrected him, and I said, I know exactly where I'm going. I do not know how to get there.
Which is a fantastic allegory for video game design in general, right?
It is. Yeah. And so I'm like, no, like, you're not wrong, because there was truth to what he was saying. It's like, no, you're right. Like, I am pretty inexperienced at this, and there are things that I'm going to get wrong, but I do really know where I want to go with this. And I can explain that, but I do need you guys to help me understand how we're going to get there, or the problems with getting there, or if maybe I should reconsider where we're going. But even at that time, though, I had a really strong sense of this is what I want to accomplish from a development perspective and from a player facing perspective. And I just kind of told Fergus, I was like, I can do this. Like, I remember I was doing junior design work, and I remember the first time we got business cards, and I had been working on Icewind Dale pretty hard, and we were doing kind of it was weird. We didn't have leads. And so it was a very strange kind of egalitarian structure. There were no leads on the team. There were just a bunch of designers, a bunch of artists, and then like a producer.
Yeah.
And I requested a business card, and I filled in designer, not junior designer.
Yeah.
And I remember Fergus saying designer, and I said, yeah.
You're like, did I start up?
I'm like, that's what I'm doing. I'm doing the same work that these guys are doing. And he's like, okay.
Yeah, that's fair.
And so again, whether it was deserved or not, I did have that confidence. And I was technically lead on 2 projects concurrently, although one was kind of frozen. I had started on one called FR6, later kind of subtitled The Black Hound, which got canceled. But for Icewind Dale 2, it was another case where I was not the first choice to be the lead. I was going to be, doing a lot of really instrumental stuff on it, but not the lead. But the first choice for that job, he really didn't want to do it because the project looked like it was going to be, and it was a death march, really. Yeah, so he was like, sorry guys, like I'm not going to stick around for this, which I do not blame him for at all.
Yeah.
But then because I had been part of the conception phase of getting the project rolling, they said, Josh, do you want to be the lead on this? I'm like, okay, let's go, get moving. We got a whole bunch of content to make and not much time.
So 2 questions then about Icewind is you talk about the vision coming off Icewind 1, being there for conception phase. Do you remember what your clear vision was for a number? Because I've been in a similar situation where I was working on one game under a lead, and then the second one was put in my lap. And I remember it kind of felt like, as my business partner was my lead at the time, my now business partner, fantastic designer. But, naturally you feel that something can go some other way, and I love that process of like just being like, okay, yeah, this is what I think it needs, and heading forward. And then the second part of that question is your first time in a directorial / lead role. What were those sort of major touchstones that you learnt in the trial by fire of that, of trying to attain that vision on this death march that you're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think right away, it was not made under the best of circumstances because Interplay, our parent company, was going through a lot of difficult times. And so in some ways it was charitably could be considered like shovelware or uncharitably considered shovelware. Yep. And I didn't want to do that though. Like I wanted to make it as good as we could make it. And there were arguments about what the timeline could or could not be. I knew I wanted it to focus on a story about kind of the misfits and outcasts of Icewind Dale kind of banding together to fight against the 10 towns for feeling like they were always kind of othered and like, whether they were goblins or doppelgangers or half demon Cambians or whatever that was, they all united under the I think it was the Band of the Chimera. So they're all like, we're all these kind of misfits, but we're united together by this opposition to these people from the 10 towns that are constantly killing us and driving us out. And reflecting back at some of the stuff from Icewind Dale 1 very lightly, there wasn't a whole lot of lore in Icewind Dale to really build off of, or maybe I just did a bad job of it, but I wanted to build on that. And I knew that I wanted to push us to do 3rd edition D&D because that was kind of the new thing. And I thought the Infinity Engine, by that point, you had a bunch of games and it was looking kind of crusty, and Neverwinter Nights was going to come out. And I'm like, man, if we're going to come out with another 2D game, we better do something mechanically to really make it appealing. And then with the other designers in the areas, because I wrote this was really a trial by fire. Steve Bacchus and I wrote the plot and laid out all the major characters and all the areas at a very high level in a 48-hour period because we had like layoffs and we had to get everyone rolling. And so my focus with the areas was to get, because the dangerous thing when you have the ice game is that everything is just ice and snow.
Of course, yeah.
And so trying to come up with like some interesting variety and take the player to interesting places so it wasn't this constant visual like I'm just looking at snow everywhere. And don't get me wrong, there's still a lot of snow in there. I knew I wanted to have the thread of the narrator, Merrily, who's the gnome, the I think she's the daughter or the niece of Oswald, the gnome, like the guy who with a flying ship. I knew I wanted to tie her and her narrative into the Black Hound, which was the other game I was working on. So I wanted, she was actually going to be a companion in the Black Hound. And in the intro cinematic where you see like the kind of like setting of a library and a desk and everything, that's the Leaves of Learning in High Moon. And so that was going to be the actual place. And so I had this grand vision of like, you're going to play the Black Hound and your mind's going to be just fucking blown when you're like, this is the thing from the game. So I had like a lot of those ideas, but then a lot of the rest of the stuff was just get her done. And it was a lot of like the most efficient pipelines we can make, reusing as much stuff as we can. We had become very adept at using the Infinity Engine and repurposing our levels, spinning them around, recompositing them, relighting them to get new levels in there. And it was just a sprint. It was like a 10-month sprint to make. It's
amazing what people...
an 85-hour game.
Like in those constraints, it's amazing what... So, like I remember, I worked at what could be considered a shovelware company as well, one of those third-party studios just pumping out games. Definitely lead on a couple of projects at the same time as well. And it's just amazing the people around you, like the ingenious decisions and tricks and everything that people make. It reminds me of the classic video game development meme of like work dumber, not harder. It's really, really incredible what some people are capable of. And so like what were do you remember a big lesson from your first sort of job leading? Did you walk away from that going like, oh, this is what a lead is, or I fucked that up? Or
I think I was too, part of it was necessity, but I was too focused on my own stuff because I had my own responsibilities that I could not effectively mentor, and I didn't really have the experience to mentor other people.
Yeah, what does it look like at that point in your career even?
Yeah, it was crazy. Like, who am I to tell these guys anything about, like, especially when it comes to like how to do, like I could say, I want to accomplish this, or we should do this with a combat or whatever. But when it came to like the particulars of scripting, I had no idea. I knew the engine limitations fairly well, but not as well as some of the other developers. Excuse me. So my lack of understanding was a hindrance. And because I had so little time to supervise other people, some of them drifted and burned out. There's at least one guy I know who left the industry because he was so burned out afterwards, which is really rough. Yeah. And I don't even know if I had the level of knowledge and expertise to really advise. Like, I knew that he was not working smart. He was not neither working smart nor dumb. He was working really hard to do something really difficult. And he burned out because he just was banging his head against the wall to do some crazy things.
Even at that point in time, there wasn't really, and there was chatter about it to some degree, like this is, but I remember that at that point as well, even a little bit later on when I was at that point in my career, we were doing crazy hours, but you don't know that it's bad. You have no idea what I hadn't even heard the phrase burnout. And obviously it's horrible looking back at it, like some of the death and so tragic, like these people, we push these talented people out of the industry, but it's like, how can you even help people when you don't know, even as a lead, when you don't know what's happening around you or how detrimental it can be, or that there are ways to work smarter.
And I would say that the other thing too is, I was a little bit better of it by the time of Icewind Dale 2, not really that much better, but especially when I first started on Icewind Dale 1, there was a point in time where I was getting some sort of repetitive stress injury in my neck. And I realized that I had come to work over 320 days in a row.
Whoa.
Like I had not, like there wasn't a weekend day, there wasn't a vacation day. I was living with roommates, but my roommates
worked with you.
me.
The classic game dev thing. Yeah.
And I was always at work. And when I started stepping away, I think it was actually because I started a relationship finally with a woman.
And she's like, this is insane. Yeah.
But it was weird. Like when I was not at work, like there was one day where I finally was like, I'm just not going to go into work today.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt so anxious and weird. It felt so weird to not go to work.
Yeah.
I was just like, I don't know what to do. Like, I don't know what I'm doing. Like, this doesn't feel right. But I started to realize like, oh, wow. And the thing is, when I say this, one, it's not to lionize it. I don't think it was good. I don't think I was doing better work because of it. I was getting burned out. But it was also not unusual. Like there were lots of other devs who, and like sometimes I went to work and I didn't really even do that much work. I just felt like I needed to be there for other people and to just be there. I think part of it maybe is because when I was in college, I lived in a fraternity house. And even though it was like the nerdy, dry gamer house, the idea of I'm just hanging out with my bros. I'm at work. Really I'm hanging out with my bros, and it's like, you have no life at all.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I had a similar situation during my crazy hours at the studio that I worked at when I was lead designer. It was like my co-writer and co-designer was my roommate as well. And we would just go into work, come home, and we would stay in there super late till 5 a.m. or something working on just Scooby-Doo games for Warner Brothers or something. But for us, we wanted to make them the best. And I really resonate with before when you were like, everyone's like, oh, the ice game. But no, I wanted to make it a good game. It's like, that's at that point in time, at that point in your career, that's how you see it. Yep. So jumping forward a little bit, because then you wound up, this is obviously all at Black Isle, but now you end up at Obsidian. So give us this skip hop and a jump over to Obsidian.
Yeah. So after Icewind 2, we moved on to do the thing that everyone in the studio really wanted to do, which is Fallout 3. But that was like, as the ship is completely vertical and going underwater.
Yeah. And just for some of our listeners here as well, when Josh says Fallout 3 here, we don't mean the Bethesda Fallout 3. We mean the original incarnation of Fallout 3, which was Interplay's follow-up to 1 and 2.
Yeah, and it was a new engine and everything. It was actually the engine that was going to be used for the other game I was the lead on, the Black Hound, but we lost the license to D&D, and that was like a big mess. And so that was 2.5 years of work on my part down the drain.
Wow.
But we got to work on Fallout 3. But then it became obvious really quickly that wasn't going to work out. So folks started leaving to form Obsidian. And at the time, I wasn't really sure that I could go over there. And I wound up because I was like, I've only ever worked with these people in this context. So I went to San Diego and I worked for Midway San Diego on a Gauntlet game. And it was basically, I jumped from one sinking ship to another sinking ship. And I was like, oh my God. I remember, this is going to sound so awful, but it's the truth. The first day I started working at Midway San Diego, I walked in and someone had written on the whiteboard, Midway will get you halfway there.
Oh shit!
And I was like, I don't think that's a good sign, man.
Yeah. It's like video game graffiti in post-apocalyptic video games.
Like that's I don't think that's good. So Midway was in rough shape then, and the project wound up. It was rough. So I left before the end of it, in part because I was like, look, man, I was very loyal to the idea of a company.
Yeah.
And that company was not a thing. It's not people. It's like, and so I'm loyal to people and I respect the people on my team, but I don't want a death march to put out this game to make a quarterly, goal basically for a credit line or something.
Someone else.
This isn't what I want to do with my life. So I went over to Obsidian and rejoined. Well, it was weird because it was like this skip of 2 years. Well, it was weird because it was a lot of the same people, but then it was a ton of people I had never seen before. A lot of them were super young. And it's weird now because I've known them now for 15 plus years.
Yeah.
But at the time I was like, who is this baby? I'm at this point, 28 or something. And these are 20-year-olds and 21-year-olds who are coming out of CS programs or now DigiPen and things like that because they were, that existed.
Yeah, it's happening.
It's happening. And so they were coming in, and we were working on Neverwinter Nights 2, and that project had a lot of problems. I was originally on it as a senior designer, and then after the lead designer left, I took over for the last 6 months of development, and it was largely a custodial job where I was just like, all right, folks.
Just like your university degree as well.
Yeah, I'm like,
forward, let's go.
Yeah, I'm like, just get shovels and mops, and we're gonna dig this out and clean it up and put it out, because it is really got a lot of problems. So yeah, that was a weird experience, because I was back to being a lead. After Midway, I was really burned out, and I said, I don't want to be a lead, but that team needed some leadership to get it out.
Yeah.
And so I don't really feel like that's one of like my games. I feel like it's a game that I helped, and maybe I harmed in some way to get out, but like it needed to get out. So yeah. And then after that, then I went on to other stuff.
Yeah. So the other stuff is, and this is where I think probably a lot of people maybe came into contact or became aware of you as a creative personally in a big way, is Fallout New Vegas.
Absolutely.
And being a part of that, which is interestingly as well, is kind of like you got a shot at Fallout 3 again. Stepping up after Bethesda's iteration on this, weird things coming back your way and these coincidences. So again, right, it's like Bethesda have a shot at Fallout 3. You were already working on it. Talk us through Fallout New Vegas lands in Obsidian's lap, and you're like, okay, what are we going to do? I imagine you must have just been exploding with ideas here.
Oh yeah. I mean, cause and it wasn't just me, like we had a bunch of people from Black Isle who had worked on Van Buren, which was the original incarnation. Yeah. And then people who had come to the studio knowing of the background, and also were like, oh my God, we're going to get to work on a Fallout game. So, I mean, we always knew it was going to be a super abbreviated timeline. It was an 18-month development cycle. But again, like most of my career up until this time, I had only worked on games that had very short development cycles, or if they had longer ones, they were canceled. Yeah. So the idea of
we want short, please. Yeah.
Yeah. So like, I mean, Icewind Dale 1 was 14 months. Icewind Dale 2 was 10 months.
Wow.
And then Neverwinter 2 was many years, but I only worked on it for the last 6 months. Yeah. Really. So then saying 18 months, I'm like, sure, that sounds fine.
Yeah, let's do it.
It's 8 more than Icewind Dale 2. We can do this. And, never having worked with the engine before, like no one on the team had, until Jorge Salgado, who was a modder, came onto our team. He had done Oscuro's Oblivion overhaul as a mod, but he was the only person on the team who had any experience with Bethesda's tech.
Yeah, because they use the TS creation kit like in-house, right? Or is it sort of different? Yeah, okay. And I guess as well, you're working on top of. Had they finished Fallout 3 by the time it was given to you?
Finished Fallout 3, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Cool. So we took that and we ran for it, and it was another case. It was like Icewind Dale 2, but I had the benefit of about 9 years of time between them to be like, okay, I can be a better leader now. And I still think there are big mistakes I made on New Vegas, but and that was my first role as an actual director. So previous to any of this, I had been a lead designer or a senior designer, which, is not quite the same thing as a director, because authority-wise, I could be overruled by other departments like animation, or could say like, no, we're not going to do that. Yeah. And as a director, it was a new thing at Obsidian, really. We had just kind of started instituting it, and it was the lead of leads, like actually being responsible for everything at a high level. Yep. And that was exciting. Yeah. And it was very fun and thrilling. And like there were some bumps along the way, and it was a little rough, but we came out with it. And when it came out initially, it was not received super well. Not horribly, but just not that favorably compared to Fallout 3. And then over time, it just kind of developed this life of its own, and people really started, I guess you could say it's a cult classic. So
yeah, it really has a cult following.
Absolutely.
It seems even, this is just an IMO, but I mean, like cursorily, it seems like almost more than a Fallout 3 in the sense of like the folks who are into New Vegas are like crazy about New Vegas.
Yeah, they're super duper into it. Yeah.
And now an interesting, my last question on New Vegas is really interesting Josh Sawyer tidbit is your mod that you released after Fallout New Vegas. So it's so interesting for a director of a video game. Like you said, you have all the power to make the calls, and then post-release, you release a mod that rebalances the game. And how did that come about? How did you?
Yeah, it's a couple of things. One is the audience that the game was released for is not the audience that I made the mod for.
Right. Yep.
I primarily, for Fallout New Vegas, there were a lot of choices I made where I understood very clearly that the primary audience of this are people who liked Fallout 3.
Yep,
so I could make changes to Fallout 3, but I didn't really feel like I could step
you're not shifting the audience. That's not your call.
Calm down. And the other thing too was that patching on PC versus console, those are different processes.
Yep.
And so what I did is I basically just, after the game came out and we had done all of our patches, I was like, well, I can just use the same tool set at home on my personal computer. And I still saved. So like when you work locally, the convention is that you have I think it's an ESP file. So, and this shows the roots of the engine, because most of the files you're dealing with are ESMs or ESPs. ESM is Elder Scrolls Master, and ESP is Elder Scrolls Personal, I think.
Yeah.
But this is the Elder Scrolls engine. And but like the P means this is your local thing, and you use your first initial last name. So that's why it's J Sawyer. So that's why the mod is just called J Sawyer. It's like this is just the private working file thing.
Yeah.
And I wanted to make it the way that I wanted to play it.
Yeah.
And I wanted to do it without compromising it for any particular audience. And so that was my approach with it. And I also was very careful to, I said, this requires all of the DLCs, which some people complained about. And I said, too bad, this is for free. Like, if you don't like my mod, don't install it. But I was just like, yep, you need all the DLCs, and this rebalances everything.
Yeah.
And this is the way that I think would be cool to play it. And if you don't like it, just either don't download it or get other mods or mod it yourself. I don't care. That's not my concern when I'm making free content for you to play.
And there's people still playing with this mod today.
Oh yeah. There's a lot of people. I mean, and there are some people who don't like all the gameplay changes or just don't like the changes at all. But it'll get incorporated into other mods or mod suites.
Yeah. Okay.
So yeah, it's I am glad that a lot of people, even after all this time, still use that in some ways, at least as a cornerstone of their suite of mods for playing the game.
So now the next sort of big step in your career came about with the Kickstarter boom, which was Pillars of Eternity, which is an interesting step as well for Obsidian, because did it end up being self-published by Obsidian, or did you get someone but it was largely funded? Just, you know what, instead of me asking questions, why don't you set it up for us? You've done Fallout New Vegas. This crazy Kickstarter boom is going on. All of a sudden, Obsidian comes onto the scene with Pillars of Eternity, obviously a huge success there on Kickstarter. Very much speaks to your history as well, the kinds of video games that you've worked on too. Tell us a little bit about how that came about, Pillars of Eternity, what happened internally at Obsidian for that little seed to hit Kickstarter.
We actually had a couple of canceled projects in the interim there. So before New Vegas, I was working on an Aliens game.
That's right. Yeah, with Sega, right?
With Sega, and that was fraught. There was like
it was an RPG, right?
It was an RPG. It actually aesthetically, superficially, kind of looks a lot like Aliens Fireteam in terms of how it was presented, like a third-person squad-based thing. I actually think Fireteam is pretty cool, by the way. Just saying that.
Side note,
and especially because I was like, God, that looks like a better version of what we were doing. But then that got canceled. We did Fallout New Vegas, and then after that, we made a game called Stormlands that was going to be a third-person action RPG, and that did not go well. And we had to lay off a lot of people, and that was rough.
Those dark days for Obsidian back then.
That was like the worst day of my career. A lot of my friends lost their job that day, and I felt very bad because that was my project that got canceled.
Yeah.
So I was not feeling good, and we were looking at doing other pitches. Obsidian as a whole was kind of suffering because of everything that was going on, and we I think Nathaniel Chapman, who was one of the designers at the studio at the time, and a few other people were noticing like Kickstarter, things like Double Fine Adventure and a couple
Yeah.
of other things had happened.
Mm.
And we started talking like, dude, I think we could do this. Like we could do something. There's got to be something we could do. And we were like, I bet if we did an Infinity Engine like game of some sort, I don't know exactly what, but I bet people would be in for it.
Tap into that nostalgia. They're not getting greenlit at the moment, just like the adventure game. Yeah.
Yeah, because nobody was interested in that stuff, especially like isometric traditional style. Like no way. So they didn't even want to do that stuff in the early 2000s. Why would they want to do it 10 years later? Like publishers were just not into it. So, but looking at how nostalgia was driving these fan-funded projects, I was like, I know that there are enough people out there who want this, that we can do this.
Yeah.
And there was actually a lot of debate internally. The owners did not want to, they did not want to do it. And we were going to leave to do it on our own.
Yeah.
And it really went to the brink. And then the owners were like, okay. Like,
yeah.
Okay, don't leave.
It is a big call for a studio that has been making these big games for however long to then all of a sudden come out, with their hat in their hand, so to speak. Because that is the Kickstarter narrative, especially at the time, is like, this game can't get made unless it's with your help, So I totally understand that predicament.
So we eventually we threatened enough, and and we got to pitch it and launch it, and it did far better than we could have ever expected in terms of the campaign. And then we had to actually make it. And working for backers is a very interesting process and mentality that you have to get into, and it has its own challenges that are very different from working for a publisher.
Yeah, absolutely.
We did that game, and that came out. It was reviewed very well. I think maybe a little better than it deserved, but thanks anyway. And it sold very well. And so it was often, I don't think it's an exaggeration in the narrative, although I don't think I should get all the credit for this because a lot of people were pushing for it, but as like the game that saved Obsidian, because we were not in great shape. And I will say that morale before the Kickstarter campaign started was really bad.
Yeah.
And the morale on the last day of funding was like the highest I've ever seen it at the company.
Yeah, so, I bet. Like everyone, and especially because it's not like, we got, Xbox gave us the tick of, funnily enough, you're owned by Xbox now, but like whoever, a big publisher gave us the tick of approval, they're going to sign this project. Okay, here we go again. It's literally the people who you're making games for coming out and saying like, no, we want this from you. Yes. And it was like, how much was it funded for as well? It was crazy. It was in the millions, wasn't it?
Oh yeah, it was like we initially asked for 1.1, and I think we hit that in 27 hours, and then we had to scramble to be like stretch goals. And then I think when the Kickstarter ended, it was 3.9.
Yeah,
and then I think we continued getting donations through other means, and it got to like 4.2 or something like that. So like, I think at the time it was like the highest funded game. Of course, other games like Star Citizen and stuff completely annihilated that. But like at the time it was like the main thing was that at the studio we were just like, oh my God, like we're doing it. And that was a really fun process. It had its own stresses, but like it turned out very well for us and for the studio. And then we went on to Deadfire after that.
All right. So you Pillars of Eternity 1, then you follow up with Deadfire. Pentiment. Now, this is, it's one thing to get Pillars of Eternity off the ground, this game that publishers didn't want to make, that was no games like that were getting funded. And then for you to follow up with Pentiment, which is even more obscure. Like I can't imagine pitching that. And you didn't go to the public for that. Like that's funded by somebody, right? Internally over there. So how do you get this? And obviously the game is phenomenal.
Thank you.
How do you get a game like Pentiment off the ground? And I think maybe the best way to start with this, is let's explain to people what Pentiment is. For our listeners who haven't, or just listen to the podcast and don't actually know what Pentiment is just yet, give us your brief sort of elevator pitch on this dream project of yours that you've just completed.
Pentiment is a narrative adventure game set in 16th century Bavaria, Oberbayern, Upper Bavaria. That is in the Holy Roman Empire, and you play a journeyman artist named Andreas Mahler, who is finishing up his Wanderjahre, his wandering years, as an artist working in a monastic scriptorium in the fictional Kearsarge Abbey and boarding in the fictional town of Tassing. And your character is living in one world and working in the other, kind of a bridge between the monastic and the secular world. And one day, a visiting nobleman is murdered, and your friend and mentor at the scriptorium, Brother Piero, is accused of crime. There is no way he did it, and you take it upon yourself to be a detective of sorts, prove that somebody else did it, or he suffers. And then this ties into a story that spans multiple murders and crazy conspiracies that take place over 25 years.
So everything that you just described is the game that people leave their big AAA studio jobs to make, because that never gets greenlit in the pipeline, right? Your historical, a medieval adventure game. And also I think it's worth talking about, for those, again, our listeners who haven't seen it, the art direction and the actual, the viewpoint of the game is just incredible as well, because the whole thing plays out like you're in one of these incredible books. You're actually part of these incredible paintings in a sort of this, amazing, like a meta-realization of Andreas Mahler, the protagonist's own craft. And it's just so wonderfully executed. I mean, the largest video game publication in the world gave this a 10 out of 10, Josh, which is crazy. Yeah. That must have been a wild day. But all right, let's do it. Tell me about how Pentiment came about. How did you even, I mean, it seems like you don't have any qualms pitching random shit to Fergus. So it seems.
Yeah, it does depend. Like, I have a sense of viability. Like, I'm not completely foolish. But I also, like I said, I think I know when things are possible. And, like with the Kickstarter thing, I was like, this can happen. Yeah, this can work. I know it can. And with Pentiment, I will say, so the end of Deadfire, without getting too lost in the weeds in that, the end of Deadfire was professionally and personally kind of a low point, which might seem weird because it reviewed very well, but it did not sell well. I had the end of a relationship happen right at the end when the game shipped.
Okay.
And so coming out of it, I was like, this sucks. We dumped all this effort into this game, and there's some haters who say that it's a big step down from the first game, and there are other people saying that it was better in most ways, but I didn't hear the good stuff. I was only hearing the haters. Yeah. And the relationship ending and splitting up and moving out and all that stuff was really rough. And so I was like, I don't even want to be around anymore. I was I don't know what to do here professionally or anything. And
I imagine, can I just make an assumption or a question here as well, that like this is, at this point, you're almost 20 years into your career as well.
Oh, yeah.
And you've not been like doing it in small, easy, gentle strokes. You must have been eternally tired as well.
Yeah. And I was just getting worn out. And it was, I think the other thing too was I was feeling very stagnant at the end of Deadfire. Like I wasn't sure if I should direct things anymore because I'm like, I feel like I've lost all perspective on this. Like I started in the industry making games like this, and I thought I understood like what the heart of these games were, but I'm being told constantly now that I don't know what I'm doing. And and I don't know what's good anymore. Like it was weird. So I just felt like I don't know what to do. And I had some ideas around that time for a game that I didn't really think I could really make, but it was very interesting to me, which was a game I had played Night in the Woods, which I eventually became friends with Scott Benson, who was one of the developers on that game, which I think is just an incredible game and opened the door for a lot of other types of games, including Pentiment. It was very inspirational to me. And I started thinking about a historical game that was like a side perspective, maybe kind of close to what you see in illuminated manuscripts and woodcuts in the early modern period, and mostly walking around and talking. So it's small in scope, not a lot of mechanics, nothing mechanically heavy, still having choice and consequence and branching storylines, but no no math, no levels, no. So I was like, this isn't a role playing game. It's more of a story game. It's more like Oxenfree or Night in the Woods or eventually Mutazione. And I had this idea also of doing things with script and type and like handwriting out letters.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember, I guess this is even before technically my girlfriend who moved out because I remember talking to her about the idea, and I was like, yeah, each letter is written in a stroke at a time. She's like, I would lose my mind. She's like, that sounds so awful. I'm like, yeah. I know what you're saying, but I think I can figure out a way to do it.
Yeah.
So I had these very vague ideas of a thing, and I'm like, I think we could do this. I think it'd be cool. But I was like, who's going to make that really? And then Microsoft acquired us.
Mm.
And in the process of being acquired, I talked to Fergus and I said, hey man, this sounds great for everybody, but I want it to be great for me. And I said, if I stay here, I want to make this game. And just this one. I don't need to do a bunch of tiny, crazy games, but I said and I'm not going to need a lot of people. I'm not going to need a lot of money. But I think it would be great for Game Pass. And that was my mentality is clever. I think Microsoft will let us do this because they just acquired us and they want to be nice and give us the benefit of the doubt. And I think also it could be good for Game Pass. And Fergus, to his credit, was very supportive right away, which every other conversation we had for 20 years prior about historical games, he was not very into.
Yeah.
But he's like, yep, we can do it. Use a small team. And that's kind of how it got going. And it started with that idea. Then I worked with my art director, Hannah Kennedy, who did an incredible job on the art style. And that was the foundation off of which everything else was built.
Amazing. And so was your Game Pass pitch correct to Microsoft? How was it received on the Microsoft side?
So the way that things, at least so far, kind of work is when you're doing stuff internally until you're really ready to go into full development, Xbox doesn't need to lean over your shoulder and micromanage everything.
Yep.
So we were just kind of making it, and we made our vertical slice, and the vertical slice really helped illustrate it far better than words could, because it's such a visual game.
Yeah.
And so we showed a trailer of our vertical slice to Xbox and then explained what we were doing. And that order of things, I think, was very critical for them going, we got it. We understand.
Yeah, cool.
And they were very supportive, and they said, yes, they were like, this is very artistic. It's very cool. It's awesome that we can have this be made by a small team within a big studio owned by Xbox.
Yeah.
And with a focus on Game Pass, making interesting games that give players an opportunity to play something that's unlike anything they've ever seen. And they might not even consider buying, but if it's on Game Pass, why not give it a try and maybe you'll enjoy it. And so, they were, again, to their credit, they were very supportive right away, very enthusiastic. At every step of the review process, they were like, thumbs up, keep going. So
awesome.
went very well.
Yeah, hell yeah. And so when you go to Hannah and you tell her what you want to do, because it's one of the greatest accomplishments is easily the art direction, and Hannah's team, no doubt, behind that as well. How did that go? How did that go down?
Well, I should say, by the way, it's funny. We did have some outside contract help from one other artist, but 98% of the art in the game was made by Hannah and Sujin Pak, two artists. Yes.
Incredible.
Two artists made the vast majority of art.
Actually, that's a great question. You said small team, small amount of money. How big was the team internally at Obsidian working on this with you?
It was 5. It was about 5, I think, through Vertical Slice.
Yeah.
And then we slowly expanded to 13 at the end. So I think the last development was 13.
Yeah. Okay. Our teams are double that. Our indies teams are double that size. I love it. Yep. So you pitch this to Hannah, and then this is sort of one part of a larger question that I'm going to ask as well, because it's not just we're going to make this game inspired by manuscripts. The degree to which you've honed in on a particular period as well, and particular regions and everything as well. had you been having conversations with Hannah about this game before, or was she sort of just like thrown on the project and she's like, what are we doing? And you pitch her and you're trying to sell her in at that point?
I had been, like friends with Hannah in a less sort of like close way, through work. And I had seen her work, and she had done some work for Pillars and Deadfire, I think both projects, but it was a very, like I wasn't working very closely with her, but I did know, that she was an incredible artist. And I also knew just from talking to her and reading some of the stuff she wrote that she had a very analytical mind. And so I had a very high degree of faith. Basically, I thought if anyone in the studio can do this, it's Hannah. Yeah. Even without working with her, I'm like, I'm pretty sure she can do this. And so she wasn't really, I'm not going to say she was like ignorant of this art in this period, but it wasn't really a focus for her. But then she really started digging into it, compiling lots of references. And then she did breakdown sheets showing these are characteristics of art in the late medieval period from different sources, and how they were made, what these elements, like what the constituent elements are, what they look like, what they mean, how to replicate that. And then she said in the early modern period, when print is becoming dominant, these are the features that are indicative of this style. Yeah. And then with that, what she did, which I think is so incredible, is she merged them, not completely blended them together, but like they coexist. So we have elements of painted manuscript style art and woodcut art within the game that coexist. And many people will say, oh, it looks just like the art from the period, but it doesn't. Yeah. It's Hannah's style, but because she is so analytical about everything that constitutes those styles, she was able to make her own style using all of those elements that looks authentic until you really do a side-by-side comparison and see the differences. And those differences she made were done, one, both to merge the styles in a way that felt harmonious, but also to work for gameplay and production, because there's no point in establishing an art style that you can't execute on. But she just, from the beginning, again, she did such fantastic foundational work that once we got going, it was very easy to see this is how the rest of the game is going to look. This is how all of our characters can be represented. And
So it's interesting that you talk about the period and, sort of a faithful recreation. It's amazing sometimes, even just in like graphic design, if you're trying to reduce something down to its smallest form to, get people to, you cut out, so you make shortcuts and everything, but you can still represent something or communicate something even when it's not the same as the original thing. It's wonderfully executed. Interesting question is, this contract artist, were they some kind of specialist that you didn't have the expertise for in-house? Was it like the scripts or was it just some more heavy lifting on the project?
It was kind of heavy lifting. I should say all the fonts were outsourced. Riley Cran and Lettermatic have a full write-up on the entire process, which was incredible. Yeah. It was a really great collaboration where Hannah and I and Brett Kluster, our programmer, and Alec Fry, our producer, who wound up doing all the stroke masks. We all worked together to create this stuff, which is an incredible process. But for the contract artist, we actually went with Emily Cheeseman, who is a fantastic illustrator. And even though her art style is not like an exact match for what we're doing, it's close enough that we were like, I bet, because we have so many scenes that go through years and seasons. Yes. And we're like, this is a lot of work that needs to be done, but do Hannah and Sujin really need to do it? And the answer was no. And so Hannah just worked with Emily to establish what was necessary and the style. And so, we would have like 80% of the scenes done, and then we needed some seasonal variants, but we had the preceding versions. And so Emily was able to take like, this is the original, this is how you interpreted everything else. So this is how, and going through it, I can't tell what scenes in the end she did versus Sujin versus Hannah. Yeah. So
amazing. So now let's switch over to, again, it's just this, it gave me this feeling playing it. Like, I remember playing Age of Empires as a kid, and a teenager or whatever, and I was in high school, and we had a geography project where we had to study some ancient civilization or something like that. And I just went to my Age of Empires Gold Edition like book that had all of it, and I was like reading in game the descriptions of things, and I literally just like filled out this project with that. And that I didn't go to the library or anything. It was just literally Age of Empires, and I got great marks. It was like maybe one of the best marks I got. But there's a beauty to these kinds of video games that are faithful to particular topics, whether it be, science or city planning or history. I felt like I was learning like the moment that I got into it. And there are so many different little narrative mechanics to assist with that. And so one of the things that I'm interested in is you tackle this for most people, for the layman and woman out there, this is the history in the specific period of history that you're drilling into, and that the sort of context that the player needs. There's obviously a huge amount of work that you've done to help bring the player into that, including the glossary mechanic and everything. So coming into this, how much of that were like ideas about, okay, here's things we can do with the narrative delivery or the narrative design or particular systems to support folks like the glossary, and how much of that was found along the way, approaching this gargantuan task of educating people on 16th century Bavarian history?
Yeah, some of it was choosing to make the narrative more about the individual relationships of people and a plot that was central to the town. That, I think, did the most to help kind of displace the complexities of a lot of the things that were going on. For example, in the second act, also focusing on like the problems of the German Peasant War and the 12 Articles were felt all across Swabia and then parts of Bavaria and Switzerland and other places. But they're also very easy to understand in a visceral sense because virtually all of them are connected to something that is very easy to understand. We're starving. You don't have money. You won't let us fish. You won't let us hunt.
Getting richer.
Like this sucks. And so even though, yes, it's kind of abstracted and it's much larger because the German Peasant War covered a huge area, but you can see it in the lives of people. You can see it in what they eat and things like that. So a lot of the problems didn't feel metaphysical or spiritual as much as very immediate to the lives of people.
The very human story at the center.
Yeah, and not just people, but like these people. There are, with the exceptions of kind of the pilgrims that are kind of background characters, there are no generic or some guards, I guess. There are no generic characters in Pentiment. Every character is a named person who has a life and a relationship with other people in the community. And that makes it a lot easier, I think, to tell a personal story about the community there. And the other thing was the glossary. We always knew that there was going to be a glossary for terms. We first used this in a game called Tyranny, which I did not work on, but Tyranny started allowing you to highlight words and see a pop-up definition for usually lore. Pillars of Eternity also used this because the lore was extremely dense. Too dense. But then I thought, well, let's reuse this. Let's figure out a new way to use this. Same basic system, but a new way to use it to help fill in the blanks. And the limitations of space actually made it, I think, more effective because we couldn't go on for 5 paragraphs about who Martin Luther was. We have a couple sentences and you're done. But that's all you really need to understand the story. Is like, what's the Council of Constance? It's this. And got it. All right.
Okay, let me move on. Because you're reading text, right? Like you're literally, you're not pausing the game, so to speak. But so just for everyone, our listeners who haven't played Pentiment yet, if you imagine like an Oxenfree or a Night in the Woods where characters on a 2D plane are talking to each other and we have text boxes come up. On those text boxes, we can have underlined, so say, for example, Martin Luther might be underlined. And when you press X, if you're playing on an Xbox gamepad at the time, the camera will pull out and you can actually see the book laid out there with your game port, like the viewport of your game actually is like an illustration in the book, and around the margins, what are they called? The illustrations around the margins again? And,
marginalia.
Yeah, marginalia. In the marginalia is just a little short paragraph that actually explains that thing, and you just press X. You're like, who the fuck is Martin Luther? Or who is Martin Luther again? And it is a beautifully succinct description for almost everything. I love when it says a character's name as well. It just shows a face, like a picture of them too. And it enables you to really quickly jump out of the game and go, okay, give me the context that I need to enjoy this narrative about this human story and the people of this town, and then be able to dive straight back in with just literally the press of a button.
Yeah, and that was actually something that came up during development, the pictures of people, because I created every character. I didn't write every character, but I created every character in the story. Mm-hmm. And of course, I remember who everyone is. I made them, but we got feedback where even in the prototype, where some people, especially our development director Justin Britch, was playing the game and he's like, I can't keep track of all these names, especially when it's tons of monks and nuns or like all these farmers. He's like, there are so many Bowers. He's like, because there are two Bower families, brothers and their wives and their children, and it becomes really confusing. And so he's like, I need some way to figure out and remember who these are. So we came up with a system that was basically the same foundation as the glossary system, but instead of giving you a definition, it just shows you their face. So when someone says, Otto says, hey, can you say hi to Ava for me? You're like, maybe. And then you look and you're like, oh, Ava, the girl back home. Okay, yeah, I got that. I can do that.
So another interesting thing is that's really beautiful about the game and feels quite singular. And maybe this is maybe I have a lack of experience with like particular visual novellas or things like that, narrative-based games. But it's really, really quite beautiful how the actual text is rendered on screen. And so you were talking before about the fonts and the different scripts. When you start the game, it tells you, hey, different types of folks in the game have different fonts to represent them. So we have a high script for, monks or whoever it might be, and the peasantry have a different script and everything. But then the beautiful nature of it being written out, and even things that are printed onto the actual text box itself, little flourishes, like even letters don't repeat in your fonts, and a lot of the time the characters don't repeat. We have people making spelling errors and then coming back later on and, a second later and correcting their spelling error, or perhaps not. These types of, and you talk about your former partner and, her speaking of the challenges of like, that's not going to happen. What was the process of just that particular part of the game, which is so much of its character and expression is in that? And last night I haven't finished it yet, but last night in my session, I was, talking to the doctors, Werner's doctor friends, and the beauty of having, selected the background for my character, of knowing some different languages through the play already and having it translated on the fly. Tell me about just the process of the text box and everything that went into that. It's just, it's so singular.
Yeah, I would say it's not an exaggeration to say that dialogue and text and font rendering constitutes the majority of feature development time. Because most of our other features are pretty straightforward. Our mini games are pretty straightforward. Our quest system is pretty basic. But I guess the journal and that stuff. But when it comes to the fonts themselves and how they're displayed, a lot of work, a lot of iterative work, different techniques for rendering strokes, different ways of, like when we first started with the initial idea that I had when talking to my former partner, where it was like, I'm drawing the H and the A, and it's that was awful. Like either it was one of two things. Either it was so fast that you really couldn't see the strokes coming in at all, or it was unbearably slow. So I came up with an idea pretty quickly, which was when 20% of a glyph is drawn, the next glyph will start drawing.
Yeah.
So that way the speed of strokes coming in can still remain slow enough for you to perceive them, but the whole line gets written in faster, because at 1.5, at any given point, there's basically 4 or 5 letters being drawn in concurrently, and that just cascades through the whole sentence.
I never even noticed that. That's amazing. That's a great example of how natural that feels once, you know.
Yeah, and it's kind of subtle, but yeah, if you can actually, not that anyone does this, but if you can slow down the speed that text comes in. Almost everyone speeds it as fast as they can to get through it. But if you slow it down, you can really, really see how it goes. And then once we got that in, then that started feeling good. And we worked with Riley about the idea of stroke masks. We went back and forth as to whether or not it should be procedural, meaning there was some process by which we were taking data from like the ductus data, the actual stroke data from the creation of the font, into something that would work in the game to render it out automatically. And no, basically I was skeptical, and it was a lot of unproven things. And I was like, we had already done some basic, I had mocked up something where we used 3 channels, like the RGB channel and the alpha, to determine a series of strokes. And then that was like, okay. And then our programmer, Brett, he reconstituted that as like, okay, we can do it this way. And so we came up with a thing where we'd work in Illustrator, make the stroke masks, export them. And that was time consuming, but it was very reliable. And so I said, we are going to John Henry this. We are going to just do it all by hand, which is very meta. So I think they said it was like, wound up being 2,700 glyphs, of which maybe 2,400 were hand scribe glyphs.
Yeah.
And so Alec and Ethan, who came on toward the end of the project to help out with a few things, they did every single stroke mask for every single character in the game. But the result is very beautiful.
Yes.
And it feels very authentic. And then we started doing other features. We added in the wet ink feature, where when it first comes in, it has a little bit of 3-dimensionality to it. It's very dark, and it has a speck on it. So it has a specular highlight. Then it gets sucked into the page. That's an actual kind of procedural animation from the outside in. Then the opacity goes down a little bit, and there's a bleed effect that we put on. So the handwritten stuff, actually, you can see under the parchment, there's kind of a reddish thing where it's soaked in and bleeding on the edges. And then we also have some stuff with the stroke masks where the strokes overlap on a character, it gets a little more opaque because you're obviously putting down more ink on top of ink. And then for the cursive font, which is it's the one in between peasant and like the super crazy monastic, that one, we have a sort of loaded pen mechanic where when the line starts, the strokes are over full. They kind of go beyond the boundaries of the glyph procedurally. And so it looks like the pen is too full. And then after a few strokes, it kind of goes to the normal glyph. And then after a few glyphs, it starts getting less opaque. It starts going down in transparency. And then it reaches a point where there's a brief pause in the writing of the line, which represents redipping the pen in ink. And then the next character is overloaded again, and that continues through the entire thing. I think the other things that we put in past that, we have the rubrication, which is writing in things in red or blue or green afterwards. We have the frantic script where there's ink spattering because the person writing it is angry. And then the printing one was a completely separate, because that's not coming in stroke by stroke.
No, of course, yeah.
But we have the, and that took a lot of iteration because it was either frustrating or not present. So we have the first time a character in a scene who has print speaks, they do the sorts, which are the metal typefaces upside down, left to right, come in, then they're inked, and then they press into the page, and there's like a press animation. And we do a procedural voids and over inking. So some of the letters have too much ink, and so they kind of, again, are a little bleeding and blurry. And then other parts have a void where it's not inked enough, and so there's just ink missing from the letter form on the page. And I might be missing some features, but like that's like all of that stuff.
I love it. Even the way that you talk about it, you can tell that you've been in this for 18 months, that it feels like you needed that pressure release valve to just be like, here we go. This is it. And it sounds like some tech artist's dream as well. Like the challenges here. It's just so beautiful.
Thank you.
Interestingly, like, again, going back to the period of it, and, seemingly as well for, I enjoy my history, but I wouldn't call myself a history buff. It is so engaging, and it seems like there's so much work has gone into it. I'm interested in the research period, or the research along the way. You're obviously part of the Xbox Studios family and everything now, with a huge amount of resources at the tip of your fingers should you need to call on it. Did you have, historians consulting with you, or on the payroll on the project? What was that process like for Josh leading up to this, and bringing in Kate and folks, and the work that you're doing there, and then the actual support from Xbox and others during the project?
Yeah. I came into it with my academic training because even though I wasn't a good student, I was passionate about the subject matter. And I kept, I kept all my books from college that still, I would still go back and reference them because I still used history in the development of other games that I worked on, especially the Pillars series, because it's like faux 16th century Europe in some cases. But so I had that, but then early on we consulted with Christopher de Hamel, who is one of maybe the most famous manuscript expert in the world.
Wow.
He has a number of like best-selling books on manuscripts, which are incredible. I had a few of them. I basically cold emailed him from finding his I found his email address on the faculty page for Corpus Christi College. And I was like, sure, do you want to do this?
Let's go. Yeah.
He was skeptical, but I met with him in London when I was there by coincidence, and he was open to it. So he gave me a lot of information about the feasibility of some of the basics of like a professional artist. Like, would a scriptorium exist? He's like, probably not.
Yeah.
He's like, if it would, it would be one of the last ones around because this is largely transitioned either to print or professional artists working outside of in a secular environment.
Yeah.
But he helped me contextualize a lot of that stuff, which was really great. Advise us on,
and that in particular is contextualized really well. It lends so much character to the story, and really ups the stakes in a major way. The fact that the scriptorium is a rarity for those times.
Yeah, it's a rarity, and it's on the way out. And in fact, like, this isn't spoiling much. You go into the second act, and we're done. Like, just 7 years later, it's like this isn't sustainable anymore.
Yeah.
So he helped inform a lot about the basics of like, I was like, could an artist have a university education? He's like, probably not. And he said, there are circumstances where it could be possible. He said, maybe if his father were connected to someone like in a university who had influence, he might be able to get a special case. And that was written into the story. Andreas's father is also an artist. He did work for the University of Erfurt, and the rector gave him this favor of allowing Andreas into school. And then he's a dropout, which so many people who played the game are like, this is targeting me because I'm a college, I dropped out of my doctoral program or whatever.
Yeah. I'm in this photo and I do not like it. Yeah.
Exactly. And then, we also had Dr. Edmund Kern, who was my advisor in college, Winston Black, who was actually a classmate of mine, but now he's, a professor and published on medieval medicine, which even though this is the early modern period, a lot of the medical practices were still effectively medieval.
Yeah.
And then for my own part, like I did a lot of research with JSTOR. There were places where my academic abilities kind of reached their limitation, and I would have to consult with Ed or Winston about certain things just to kind of go like, I don't know anymore. Like I can't, there's only so much I can find. And they're experts. So rely on the experts. And then, we also had Zoe Franznick came on as a writer kind of late in the project, and she has a background as a medievalist and doing manuscript studies. She also was a Latinist and a Latin teacher. We additionally had a Latin consultant who goes back to my college days because I went to one of the few universities in the United States that has an undergraduate classics program. So I reached out to my friend Heather Nabafeld, who is a teacher at Boston Latin School. And we had 3 tiers of Latin where I know Latin reasonably well and I can do a lot of the basic translations. Then Zoe was like the next tier, and especially when it came to manuscript stuff. And then for the super like intense stuff, we would go to Heather and say like, Heather, how would we do this? And she would help us with that. But yeah, it was we have a bibliography published because we really did consult a lot of books. And articles, scholarly articles. And sometimes I would reach out, Dr. Deborah Cashin, I remember reaching out to because I read, she was part of a compilation of books on basically art creation and production in this period. And I kind of hit a dead end, and I was just like, well, she's the editor. And so I emailed her and I was like, can I just ask you this question about this thing? And she was super helpful. And I said, do you want to be a consultant on the game? And she's like, I don't have time, but I'm glad you're doing this. I hope it gets people interested in this stuff. I said, well, I'll give you a special thanks. And she's like, great, awesome. So yeah, it is funny because I remember talking to some academics early on about this project, and I can't remember who I was talking to, but she said, the money will be great because it's academia, but I think they're just going to be happy that anyone is coming to them sincerely wanting to hear them like go on and on about their thing as much as possible. And that's kind of the case. They're like, I'm going to tell you all about it. So they're just happy to be part of the process. But yeah.
The best part, I've seen, just various things you posted on Twitter recently, and in your replies, you've now got these like, history sickos, and weirdos, all the history buffs from around the world that you've smoked out. Very specific. Like I saw one, it seemed like a lovely, lovely guy who was asked a question about why the pig's fat and not skinny. It's like it's really impressive when you, and what a great little testament to the work that you've done, that these people that you've rallied, those people that that we're talking about here, these experts in their craft, that finally this game that's come out, everything's about Dungeons and Dragons or swords and wizards and witches, and now finally something about a scriptorium in 16th century Bavaria. It's an amazing just subject matter. And so one of the things I loved about working on licensed games was, the first game I ever worked on was I did some writing on a game called Zoo Hospital, but the next one was Monster Jam Urban Assault. And I'm like, I'm not a monster truck guy or anything. And, Monster Jam's an American license. So in Australia, I was like, okay, what's this? And by the end, I had like a little grave digger on my desk, and we took the team to see the monster trucks, and you see the appreciation, like you see the beauty when you're sort of forced, or whether it be by choice, to dive into something, you really can see the beauty that these other folks, these experts that we're talking about, these buffs, see in it. And so did you see across the team, across this, you're a ragtag bunch from Obsidian that you'd pulled into this little wily history project of yours, did you see their interest in these things like shift and peak over time? And
yeah, I think I don't think that every single person working on the game is like the number one fan of everything in the game, but I did see a growing appreciation for everything we were doing in the game. And some people really got into a lot of the stuff in a very sincere and genuine way. And I think for me, like I said, it was I felt very burned out at the end of Deadfire, and I wasn't sure what I should do, but this is all I really know how to do. And going back to my musical background and my musical theater background, one of my big inspirations was always Stephen Sondheim, whose music I love, but also when I started seeing interviews with him and reading the things about his life and his sort of approach to teaching and making music, I really gained an appreciation of him as a human being. And there were two things that he really impressed, which was like, teaching is more important than any other thing that you can do. And you can teach through your work, but you have to also teach outside of your work. And he, there's like some great videos of him doing like master classes where he's advising young singers about how to interpret, which I love watching all those, both because of his interactions with them, but also his warmth. Like he is teaching them important things, but he's doing it in a very just kind of warm way that I kind of took a lot from that. And then also he talks there's a film called Six by Sondheim where it's kind of a documentary about his life. And he talks about he did a show that was really done for money. Like it was like, this is going to be quick. It's going to be easy. It's going to make a lot of money. And he was like, it was the wrong mentality. And he went into it kind of not feeling great about it. And he came out just feeling absolutely awful. And he concluded that love is basically the only reason to do anything, which one of the characters in Pentiment actually says that very explicitly at one point. Like there's no reason to do it if you don't love it. And so I tried with Pentiment, everything that we did, like obviously I'm considering an audience playing it, but I didn't do anything with, gritted teeth. I didn't do anything under duress. Everything was done because I loved it and I wanted to share that love with people. And I believe that did wear off on the team, again, to a certain extent. I don't think they're all crazy 16th century art fans. But I think that's the thing, is that tons of people who've played the game have said that they feel that level of respect and care for the subject matter and the passion for communicating it with other people.
And it's such a beautiful loop back to the start of our conversation, where we came into this podcast talking about your love for cycling and battling with trying to get parts throughout COVID, or even being able to get out on the bike. And after such a long and storied career that we've now stepped through, do you think that is like, what is the sort of the key for you now? I mean, like coming, especially after such burnout and everything, coming off Deadfire and into Pentiment, are you finding more of a balanced lifestyle is obviously, like helping you out? Is it the love thing? What do you reckon, Josh, in the last few minutes that we've got here? And if we're talking about teaching, perhaps for our younger developers that are finding themselves in that period that, you and I were in our mid-20s, when we just want every game to be the best and willing to throw ourselves on the pyre.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I will say again, going back to something we talked about at the beginning, luck and privilege have played a large role in me getting into the industry, surviving in the industry, getting as far as I have in the industry. The fact that I kind of made kind of an ultimatum to get this made is also privilege. Like, not a random person can't really get away with doing that.
Yeah.
So it's it would be very cavalier for me to say like, everybody only work on things that you love 100%.
Yeah.
But I will say that if you don't have love in your life, it's going to be really hard to get through what you're doing. And sometimes your love is not in your work. And you got to just do what needs to be done to get through it. But I think it's that absence where you're just kind of completely bereft of it that's very difficult to deal with. And for me, I don't know in the future. I think maybe for this project, like I've been love pilled. So now I can't, it's like if I don't really love it, I can't do it. But I love a lot of things and I can find love in a lot of things. Yeah. And hopefully I can communicate that with other people and get them as stoked, or at least half as stoked about it as I am, to make more things. And I don't know if that's going to be more small games. I don't know if it's going to be narrative games. Maybe it'll be big games. Maybe I'll go back to, I like guns too.
Yeah. Like, you can shoot some stuff every now and then.
I mean, that's like Fallout New Vegas. Like I actually did like doing all the gun research and things like that. I like bicycles. I like art. But there's a lot of things that I can find love in, and I can find something to grab onto and to hopefully pull teams into that and get them enthusiastic. And obviously the bigger the team, the harder it is to get everyone on board, but that's part of the job. And the hardest part I think is when, if you don't believe in it, especially as a leader, if you don't believe in it, nobody else is going to believe in it. And if you don't have passion for it, you can't infect anyone else with a passion that you don't have. So you got to find something to love in what you're doing. And like you said, sometimes you go into something and you're like, I don't know anything about it. Maybe I'm even a little off put by it, but let me give it a shot. Let me dig into it and find out what other people love about it. And it's not always going to work. Sometimes you come out of it and it's just not your thing. For example, I'll just give this brief example. I hate casinos and casino games, but I knew people would want them in New Vegas. And what I came to love is I love cards. I love card art. I love the aesthetics of the table and animations and stuff like that. And so even though I'm like, I don't really like this stuff, but I know some people like it and they love the randomness and they love the feeling of winning, I was like, okay, I can embrace that, and I can embrace the aesthetics and the coolness of the animations and the sight of the cards turning over. I do like that stuff genuinely, and I got into that from the presentation angle. And the rest of it, I'm like, all right, I hope I did an okay job and people are okay with it. So sometimes it's you got to find what you can love about it to bring to it. But yeah.
Find that love in what you do and outside of work as well.
Yep,
a beautiful
definitely.
place to leave it, Josh. Well, thank you so much for joining us here today. And again, huge congratulations to yourself and your team, and the broader Obsidian crew and the folks over at Xbox who, backed you, and every review gave you the thumbs up. It's such a beautiful thing to hear that, these big titans of industry as well are supporting such phenomenal projects. Who would have thought it 10, 15 years ago? So congratulations again. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me.